All right, it has started. You get to hear fantasy schizo ranting. So, it is me, Sai, using a friend's computer because my computer sucks, here to explain worlds and their concepts. However, we have some terms and timelines. You can't read this. I can barely read it. It's my handwriting. So I'm just going to start going. So, before the multiverse or the omniverse finally kicked itself off, it was just a multiverse of 20 different individual worlds. These first 12, which are perfect circles, are generally considered the timeline worlds, which are just like, you got our normal one, world lines, normal world, which is all using German words to differentiate it from, say, the first world or world one, because later down on the line, the multiverse has other worlds that it creates separate from these. So, we have world eins, that's just your normal world. This is just general, normal, bad handwriting, which means, no, not human. This would just, be normal. This doesn't mean that it was the first world, but this just means that it is basically like, you get cities, and you get your basic concepts down for what a world would be. This next one is known as the high fantasy. However, this is the only other world that was not yet populated by the Womanic. The Womanic were, in essence, because this could be its own whole video, the Womanic were the proto-humans, but they were just better humans because they were the combination, Prometheus style almost, of the masculine, the feminine, and the androgyny, which these were just basic terms used to describe what they used to be called. They weren't strictly masculine, feminine, or androgyny. It's just easier to understand how they worked through that lens. Realistically, this was physical body, the thought of the body, and the emotions of the body. When it was given the ideas of masculine being the movement of the body itself, because masculine creatures are generally much larger, generally. Sexual dimorphism is its own thing. Emotions of the body were seen through women because of their menstrual cycles. And the androgyny part would just be the thoughts and actions of the body, because it's more of like every being has thoughts and actions. So at this time, the Womanic just figured out from normal world the existence of normal magic. So this is where the high fantasy world came from. High fantasy world was basically the scientists of this world used this as a simulation. These two worlds, worlds eins and zwei, are the, in air quotes, for at least zwei, the temps. What do I mean by temps? Well, it just so happened that High Fantasy World Zwei just had no one on it. Every other world also had Womanics. And it was from this that a very big issue began to arise. World Zwei, or Die, this third world, is known as the, in air quotes, the Futurama world. And Futurama, not just the comedy show, but it's Futurama world because it's basically the future with an understood past. What do I mean by that? Well, Futurama, if you don't know, basically the guy is like frozen in time until like the very far future. The Futurama world it was nicknamed this because it only became known in its future despite it having a normal thought of past. So they all had caveman eras. It's just that this one was more advanced and a faster amount of time. So these two worlds, normal and high fantasy, only found its existence through its future, which means it would basically be the futuristic Womanics at this point in time, where we're basically cyberpunk almost, with a mixture between like nanomachines and your general just high octane future thought. Now, unlike a lot of the other worlds, this one was the least to interact with each other because it was advanced enough to where its technology was basically used in conjunction with high fantasy, World 5, and World High were interconnected to the fact that they could reach all other multiverses. World number 2 was the opposite of Futurama in the literal sense. It was backtrack world, where it wasn't that time flowed backwards, it's that the way we experienced our idea of technological advancement was backwards. See? So, say for example, this has an understood past. This had an understood past too, but this understood past was basically what we would see as the far future. The way they thought of the world was that they were born in the peak of humanity. So, these Womanic believed that, or peak of existence, so these Womanic said that they wanted to experience the past. So they began to innovate more and more primitive technology slowly over and over and over and over again until, I guess by this point, before the multiverse decided to die, which, no, this does not mean it died, before it decided to die in on itself and become an omniverse, they were at the point of the 1800s, horse races and carriages. Next, this is more out of hyperfixation. JoJo, yes, but not in like just JoJo in that. This is basically Via is stands. It's just stands. Like, it's basically JoJo if it didn't have all of its parts and just stands existed. My Hero Academia almost, but with JoJo stands. Like, it was a normal society just with stands. And it was understood that stands existed. Oh, I got lots of time. Perfect. This was more out of hyperfixation and meta than anything else because JoJo is one of my biggest inspirations. One of them. I'll get to the next one when we get to Fonzie. The next one, there's JoJo, and then the next one is basically nicknamed Psychosis. Now this world existed in a perpetual state of being high out of their goddamn mind. Like, this is psilocybin mushroom style. Psilocybin mushroom style. To give an idea, this world's entire existence was basically their lungs were built to contain lots of air at once. Or wasn't that it was built to contain lots of air at once? The air that they breathed basically had a lot more oxygen particles, but it also operated on the idea, or operated both on a combination of hallucinogens and the conspiracy theory idea that oxygen is just like an inhibitor of what we would see the real world as. This is a literal example of this, where the air that they breathed was actually like made of like psilocybin and like other psychedelics, but oxygen kind of dampened it. But there's more oxygen, and because there was more oxygen, the Womanic ended up dying faster because there was more oxygen to breathe. It's a weird process that I remember ages ago. And as they got older, they began to feel more effects from the psilocybin. So roughly, the lifespan for them was about 25 years. So by the time they were like 17, 18, 16 at the younger side, they would all begin to believe, like see the world as it truly was, or through the influence of the psilocybin in the air. On the flip side is no-R, which is misleading, because it wasn't no-R, it was colorless. And not colorless in that only saw no color, it's that there was no color. There was no color or light at all. They could produce light, but the light they produced was just heat. And when things heat up, that would just genuinely create just a bright light, but there was no way that objects in this area could reflect that light. So all you would basically get is, if you appeared here and you had your normal light, that would glow. But if someone lit a torch or a magnesium torch in the same world across from you, they would only be able to see that torch and themselves. They would not be able to see you, well, and they would be able to see you, but they wouldn't be able to see the world around them. Because of this, echolocation for everything in this world was dire, and Woolmanic basically don't exist here because they're very color-based creatures, very like section creatures, and other animals were more adept at night vision, and not just night vision, but like alternate forms of vision, such as infrared or UV in some cases, because in some parts of this world there was sunlight, but that sunlight couldn't bounce off anywhere, so it was just like the sun was here, the world was here, a certain point would only get sunlight. That would be UV, and then there would be the internal parts which would run off, or the cave systems would run off of sound. Everything else would be infrared. This would be, all right, Zeben. This is where things get a little crazy. Zeben is, technically speaking, 2, 4, 6, 7. No, wait. 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 10. Future. I'm messing on my numbers. Oh, I just put stands different than backtrack. Okay. Back in time, JoJo, psychosis. That noir was Veer, so darkness. 8. This is where it actually gets a little on the weird side. See, Oct would be, well, I'm just gonna call it white. But not because like, oh, it's popular but mostly about white creatures or it's blinding and it's the opposite of noir. No, white as in this world is the most affected by a concept that will come in later. So I'll explain the concept now. Just keep in mind that this is what white is. It's also known as the canvas world, and it runs off of belief, which belief is if enough sentient creatures believe in something hard enough, or if a sentient creature believes in something hard enough, or enough of them exist to believe in something, then that what they believe in will come true. And as time goes on, the more volatile stories that they originally created become more concrete, and it changes less, and you basically get your Greek mythology, your gods, your deities. In this world, it was basically a blank canvas. So like the earlier versions of belief, because the Woolmanic are very unified at this moment. The earlier version of belief, this is basically where artists and artisans and creators would go to experiment with what their ideas would look like, because belief was so influential of this area. This does not continue it, but this does. Up next, 9 is the space world. Space world. And by space, it is basically, all of these do have galaxies and stuff. The space world was just the biggest of the galaxies. And by biggest, I mean space travel. But, I will say this now, biggest in terms of space means that there's big amounts of space between galaxies. When we get to this, space is a completely different thing. Space is an actual concept of space. Right next to the space world, which, by the way, none of this is actually connected linearly. It's just that the way we see them as is linear. Realistically, they would be going down and not to the side, which I'll get into later by one of Zwanzig, which, I don't know if I'll have enough time, actually. I'll just run through them quickly then. Up next after space is fruit, which this is where we get our first monster, as we consider it, which would be the plant people. The plant people were a biological race of basically plant creatures that looked and appeared more like a combination of a lily pad and a mushroom, how you generally see it, but the way they were born was basically out of the cordyceps virus, which infected a specific kind of lily plant in the area that was basically based off of the red spider lily. And when you died, when a normal animal would die, it would latch onto the spider lily plant, and then the cordyceps would basically create a zombie out of it. This is the worst. This was a more hostile world, second only to the world next to it, which was basically primal. Not the new show, but primal as in monsters. Primal and as in monsters would just be your more animalistic things, such as your wild boar and your dragons. This is where those concepts came from. However, primal, if you were to put this in like the chart that I mentioned, where it was go down and then extra things would go out, this would probably be, primal would probably be the most like broken up. You like the space where primal wouldn't be there. Instead, primal would just be in the background of all of them, because primal is where all the animals came from. The way they got to different worlds and stuff was basically through a combination of magic and certain sapient belief. Sure, there are unique creatures in each one. Primal just has the more primal ones like giant snails, dragons, etc., etc., such and so miscellany. After primal is Prototech. Prototech is actually a combination. World Zolf is a combination between the efforts of high fantasy and futuristic, high fantasy and Futurama, where Prototech is a combination between magic and technology. And it follows a similar style to Backtrack, but they do go linear. It's just that as they go linear, they always think back of the past. And I guess the best way you can think of this is Leonardo da Vinci's world, like greatest thing in the world. Up next is what I am actually going to have to explain more things now. So I explained belief and I explained womatic. Now I'm going to explain pages. Originally, in these worlds, you generally couldn't talk to each other outside of other magical means. So an array, which is basically a god or deity over a concept, such as, in this case, books and knowledge, Vivel, the array over that, created creatures called pages, which are basically flecks of his own skin that acted like book pages, that flew like birds, and basically took ideas from everywhere, or not ideas as in like creation ideas, but like political and social and economic ideas. Economic ideas from everywhere else, and just started spreading it out. It was more like the way you would send a letter off to a friend before the advent of technology. You would basically look for a page, say who, like what you want to do on it, who you want, what kind of person you want it to go to, and it would go there. Vivel did not anticipate that what the pages could do could be harmful until a charred page came, which is basically when a page gets given like something that's generally seen as bad. Usually this is, at the first it was like lust and sin, and it just got ink blots. Then it just became like mass murder, deeper stuff that just turned the entire page black. This spread ideas of that stuff everywhere. And because of this, the pages were gone. They were eliminated and Vivel was bound. Binding is a concept created by the Womanic and because of the array and soon adopted by other like creatures, where basically you would take a very spiritually charged entity and bind it to a specific place, idea, or part of itself, and basically invert it to where it only works on itself and it has no influence. It still keeps its abilities, just not its influence over the multiverse or influence over its domain. Vivel was bound upside down like a mangrove tree because that was the last place people found him, or the array found him. When he was bound, pages were lost. So the idea that like other ideas of like self-control, which was a big thing, were lost. Everything began to be overpopulated. Kind of like how Earth right now is overpopulated. But not until Fizz happened. Fizz is the Diora, or Diorae are classed in different like class systems. Vival is Korra, Fizz is Diora, and Fizz is the Diora of basically like chaos and destruction, and he was in space, and at this point in time, because of other Ore, the stars that basically were in all the galaxies that floated outside of them, the bigger stars that we would basically see as like host stars, like our sun, were basically like sentient beings that were like far apart from each other, so they couldn't talk much. So Fizz looked to one star that was extremely lonely and said, "Hey, why don't you go fly that way?" And the star was like, "I can't," because of a complex form of thought. So Fizz just kicked back, or whipped back a giant tail, and sent the star flying. Star didn't stop. The star hit a bunch of other celestial beings, created the moon for the space world that Earth. And as it hit a large set of like rocks at different points in time, creating different moons and celestial beings, and it split into small enough particles of its cognitive thought that it split the womanic down to its original 3 components: man, woman, androgyny, or man, woman, shadow. Man and woman split, doubling the already giant population of each world, and then the shadows secluded themselves, which wouldn't sound bad until you realize that shadow, if you were man and woman, were only joined by shadow, so like a sandwich. But without shadow, man and woman were lost, and they began to go with whoever they wanted to. They began to give in to what now were their more primal urges. Overpopulation was becoming a big issue. So these next worlds, from Draizin to Funzin, or Zvanzin, well, Draizin and Nuinzin were basically worlds where everything began to basically go to shit, almost. Where everything was overpopulated and they had to get out now. So humans went to this first triangle world, which was known as Conspiracy. Conspiracy is when monsters started to form. And it got its shape, the triangle shape, from the fact that these monsters basically formed a trifecta of Earth, Hell, and Heaven. This is where religion first started. But it's called conspiracy because of what it's now known as Draizin, aka Crazy Town. Because everyone that was here was flocking here. And new ideas were flooding. New space was flooding. This created basically the first organized religion known as Proto-Catholicism, which is basically Catholicism, but in its very basic fundamental ideas of there's earth, there's heaven, there's hell, and there's a deity over heaven. That's it. There was no angels, demons, or anything. Hell is just where people went if they just didn't believe in the heaven guy. And by proxy, people living in hell just went back to earth. And they either went up here or went to hell. And that was basically the way they saw things. That became overpopulated. So then they went to Egg, or the mother world. Egg was, aka Virusin, or the mother world, was basically where mothers would go to conceive children, almost. And it's not like, oh, conceive children, that's like they're doing sex. No, this is basically where this was an attempt to section off children and women before the children went off into the other worlds. In this attempt, this also created the flat, or world of malleability. Egg was basically where the women and children went to basically be born and eat and stuff. Flat would basically be what would happen where all the children went to basically have fun. See, with flat though, flat also didn't have like a lot of authority over it, because it was also an attempt to create like another authority, like another form of government, another form of control. So where flat worked was it was a world based off of liberation and freedom, but it required a parental figure. This is where our ideas of actual democratic government, but in its most basic form, where everyone wanted a voice but needed someone over them. So it was like a republic. They wanted a voice, but there's someone over them. And this spread, and that was basically it for a really long time, until conspiracy found a way to get to Agartha. Agartha is hollow earth. It's the thing that the Nazis wanted to find. Not Nazi. Hollow earth. This is basically this was what was turned into hell. However, it didn't inhabit the spirits from hell. It inhabited demons, because by this point, society, thanks to Flat and all the other like combinations of worlds, created other religions and other versions of monsters. At this point in time, underneath all of this was another subset of world, or another dimension or world for demons and stripped souls. This was the creation of classic demonics. I will get into that whenever I get to Svante. In short, this is where your traditional demons would come from. This is where our angels would come from. Until Halo, aka Halo Zine 17 Halo. This was a combination of space and religion. Halo rings. This was the creation of basically Halo rings. And this is where if these were our demons, H for Hollow Earth, this is where would be our angels. And again, at this point, like, to give an idea of how chaotic this is getting, the world's populations were so incredibly spread out over these 9 worlds that they couldn't breed with each other anymore. So that's actually what this next one was. This was basically blank space. This was housing, or blank space. Again, I keep reiterating this because it's a good idea to think of. The world is so overpopulated. Each world is so overpopulated that even if they tried to breed with each other, there's so many people and so many different breeding things that just by existing in 2 different kinds of homes, the genetic basically, and through the belief and through other issues like scientifically and genetically, there were so many different kinds of environments each person would live in that each and every tiny little town almost in some of these worlds created its own version of a human. So they went to this. This was the world known as Heresy world, because this is where classic demonic breeding Classic demonics basically exist when the soul finally stops going to any afterlife that's created through conspiracy or anything. Stops going to any afterlife. And just goes to a place called X, which is basically a giant filter that separates what you experienced from you. You lose everything and just be reincarnated or brought back through your religion, which will be more prevalent after this. But in, again, essence, the emotions and thoughts and experiences from Esks created classic demonics. They're not demons, but they're basically what we base the look of demons off of. So, Why is breeding happening between the classic mnemonics? Well, they needed genetic diversity. But you're thinking, oh, well, if each one of them is genetically diverse, well, because of their own living conditions, well, maybe that's good. It means they can't breed at all. Because, not just at all, it's that. So let's use Prototech at this point as an example. Prototech is the combination between high fantasy and Futurama. The world, each little town was so genetically diverse from each other that you could take someone from a town right next to another one and breed them, and it basically caused a genetic deformity. And slowly over time, diseases were cropping up that basically took over the scattered genetics of each person. For example, in many worlds that revolve around technology, there was a disease known as lung grinding, or aka gear breathing or lung grinding, where it was a disease created by basically the anthrax bacteria, a version of the anthrax bacteria in combination with a spore-like other disease, where they basically fused through an anthrax supervirus fused with a spore that made it airborne. It would bind to metal particles in the air in certain areas, and it would basically attach itself to the lungs and be spread and grow like a disease, because the fungus would grow within and the anthrax would grow separately, and then when they combined, they grabbed the metallic particles from the air. This basically ravaged anything related to metal, or any world with metal in the air. So that kind of just extreme ravaging of a specific world compromises it. This was a compromise, but it compromises it. And when a world's compromised, there's less space, so it pushes everything out and it spreads more disease. It basically makes it to where you can't breed with another species, but you also can't survive in your own place to live on to breed. So it's basically just eliminating the earth, or every earth. With heresy, their goal was to breed with each other, particularly high fantasy and space and conspiracy. They were breeding with heresy to create basically other versions of humans that could live in far more superior climates. This is what created our basic monsters that are demonic in nature or angelic in nature, but are basically tied to biology, like elves, gnomes, vampires, werewolves, werebears, viruses such as werewolves and werebears, etc., etc., etc. And now for the best part. Zwanzig, aka war. Zwanzig was basically the physically largest world, and it was barren, completely barren. This was empty. It was literally, there weren't even plants. There was just rock and sand and dirt and ocean, but no living creature. By this point in time, there's basically an overflow of classic demonics because everything's dying over here, but there's also a breeding of classic demonics to create more powerful humans. So after thousands upon millions of years, there's basically a giant conflict between basically every little species from human, those elves and more angelic creatures, the darker creatures, classic demonics, and even then classic demonics already warring with themselves, so other classic demonics were forming. The tensions were so high, belief was so high that they would win on each side, that if from World Zwanzig, it split the entire multiverse. Every single world got a branch. And it basically spread out everything to where if it could exist, it does. However, this war was never resolved. Because belief split the multiverse how it did, this war is always ongoing, because there's always going to be some form of war. This is what now gives Zwanzig its name, Rant. Rant is like Esks. It has no meaning. However, unlike Esks, which is just hard to say, Rant is just a harsh word to say. It's a harsh environment. There have been attempts to grow food, keep livestock, but it dies. Only those that exist for war can exist here. It is now basically like a prison camp. I explain everything? Pages? Romantic? Yes. Yes, I did. I take a picture, and then that should be it. Give you guys a chance to look at that. Again, this is disconnected and confusing, but that's basically me. I'm a disconnected and confusing person, so expect the unexpected from me. Alright? I guess, see you.